Hi, my name is Virginia Lee Montgomery, and my day job is working as a graphic facilitator. Graphic facilitation is the use of large-scale imagery to educate a group about an idea. And the method of graphic facilitation is used in various process meetings, seminars, workshops, and conferences. And what I do specifically as a graphic facilitator is I perform the real-time translation of turning words into pictures. And I do this by standing in front of a large whiteboard with large special markers. And as a presenter is speaking, I'm actively listening for big ideas, concepts, key insights, and I take all of that content and I distill it down into visual imagery. And then I write and draw infographics, pictures, any type of symbol that will encapsulate the core meaning of that message. And then the end result is a large visual mural, which represents all the main insights that have been shared out over the conversation. And the value in graphic facilitation is that it provides meeting attendees an opportunity to really engage with the content and, more importantly, actually remember it. So if you imagine a meeting situation for a nonprofit where you're sitting through 8 hours of meetings back to back to back all day, I can be there to create a visual mural for every hour of content. So that way, at the end of the day, there are visual meeting notes that share what has happened. So that's my role as a creative service provider.
That's so cool. It's like you're a live comic book artist.
It's a really fascinating profession. And I should also mention, a lot of people ask me if I invented it, and I didn't. It's something that has been around since actually the 1970s. It came out of the Bay Area when architects were being asked by computer scientists to create visual maps of, I guess, computer processes. And it was around that moment that someone had the insight that when an individual stands in front of a large whiteboard and live captures everything that's being said, it just really helps bring clarity to super complicated conversations. And since the 70s, it's something that's just kind of slowly infiltrated the world of workshops and conferences as a live capture information sharing tool. So it is kind of a combination of being a comic book artist and a live language translator, and then being a strategic thinker. It's a really uncanny career in that it encapsulates so much. And it also is something that can be used by every single different type of sector. So my clients can be nonprofits that are focused in literacy. They can also be large tech companies like IBM making AI. I mean, it's everything. As long as there's people talking, I can turn it into pictures and words.
Wow, endlessly versatile. Okay, so that does sort of lead into my next question, which is, I mean, clearly this requires a person with a certain skill set, which includes the way your brain works. How did you get into this line of work?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because it is very niche, and it's not something that I knew about when I first studied art as an undergraduate at the University of Texas, Austin. It wasn't until I moved to New York City at age 21 in 2008 that I encountered graphic facilitation unexpectedly while working as an admin at a marketing firm. And I should preface by saying that I think, like a lot of millennials that graduated around 2008 and understood the extent to how terrible the economic collapse was and how limited the job market was, I, as a young artist excited to live in New York City, really was just taking any job I could find. And that happened to be being an admin at a marketing innovation consultancy firm. But there I saw graphic facilitation being used in a focus group setting where I think the actual project was for a deodorant company. Maybe it was like Axe body spray. And they invited all these different teenage boys from New Jersey to come in and share their preferences about deodorant body spray. And there was a graphic facilitator in the room capturing every comment every teen boy was saying about deodorant and turning it into a large visual mural. And I was just in awe. And I thought, okay, I have an art background. I've been able to survive speaking corporatese in this setting. I think I can do this. And so it was in that moment that I thought, I'm gonna kind of pivot. I'm gonna pursue graphic facilitation, and I did it truthfully by reaching out to a woman that I found online in the New York City area and asking if I could be her apprentice. And I built up the skill set, and since then, I've really never looked back. So that's my experience.
Amazing. So you still are doing it. You've been doing it through the pandemic and everything too.
Yes, I've been doing it through the pandemic. I've been working as a graphic facilitator to support myself for, I want to say, almost 10 years now. I did it throughout grad school, and yes, I've been doing it throughout the pandemic. However, the way that it's done now is similarly virtual, like everything that's been going on throughout the pandemic. So now I have a document camera that faces a small whiteboard, and then that's integrated into a live stream. So clients can actually watch my hand, draw it out, and I call it digital analog.
Ooh, I love that. Okay, that reminds me of a question I want to ask later about your hand. But okay, but in terms of before the pandemic and here's hoping after the pandemic, what is sort of a day in the life of you as a graphic facilitator? I imagine you have to travel usually for this job.
Yes, the amount of travel involved is quite prolific. So pre-pandemic, my schedule had me on an airplane every week, flying out to a different convention or seminar or workshop somewhere in North America. I'm a North American specific scribe. And a lot of my work was attained through an agent. So I also had an agent that would help book me out on conferences. And where these conferences would be located could be everywhere, but primarily we're in large cities like Atlanta or Orlando or Las Vegas. And the conferences themselves could span every type of industry topic like hospitality, technology, healthcare, anything and everything. And the day in the life, I mean, it's a lot of waking up very early, taking a lift to the airport, being on an airplane, trying to sleep, and then getting off of an airplane at a convention center hotel and just being thrust into an environment with tens of thousands of people. I mean, the amount of people that attend these different industry sector conferences is immense. I know in Austin, for example, there is South by Southwest Interactive. So imagine a version of South by Southwest Interactive happening at a somewhat smaller scale, but I would say at a same level of intensity every week in a different city around the United States.
Whoa.
And yeah, absolutely. So I feel like a day in the life would be me walking down a huge convention center floor with a gigantic 8-foot by 4-foot piece of white foam core board and markers and an easel and trying to like hustle myself to the next keynote speaker presentation as I'm weaving throughout a crowd of 10,000 male data engineers. And there's just like me in my black suit with my ponytail. It's a very surreal profession. So, but that gives a sense. I mean, it's working as a graphic facilitator, I'm just constantly aware of how absolutely complex our country is and how many different industries there are and so many different people that are working so many different career paths. And it's like a big ecosystem to make everything run smooth. And so I'm just like one service provider inside that theatrical large space of information sharing.
Yeah. It sounds like, well, if you're on the move all the time and maybe you have to stay over, maybe you don't. I'm curious in terms of your art practice, if you've been doing this for a decade, I mean, how did you first sort of balance that? I'm wondering, like, your current practice, did that sort of come out of, a necessity as the mother of invention to some degree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've always known my entire life I wanted to be an artist. And then, the tricky part was just thinking, how do you survive? And so it's been very rare moments in my career as an artist where I've ever had access to kind of the proverbial white walled studio space. Instead, I've always just been kind of carving out these spaces and moments in time onto which I could create my artwork. So, over the span of a decade where I've been traveling every week as a graphic facilitator, spending 3 nights a week at maybe a Marriott hotel adjacent to the Atlanta Convention Center, that Atlanta hotel room became my studio. I mean, it became my everything space. It was the space where I would sleep and dress and rest, but it was also the space where I would make my art. So I just rolled with it. I think my desire to create artwork was greater than my desire to do art production the normal way, the typical way, the reverence of the studio. So I set up a system for myself where, as I would travel from hotel room to hotel room and conference to conference or on airplane to airplane, I would bring with me a small suitcase filled with various props that I would film in those different locations. And one of them became this 3 foot long blonde ponytail prop that I would pull out of my suitcase and film myself very performatively interacting with it in the hotel room. And it would be an activity that I have to admit would not be very goal oriented in the moment, other than just as a form of like psychic mapping of like, here I am in this moment in time. I'm using this like weird ponytail doubling prop. And, in 5 hours' time, I'm going to be on this flight from Atlanta back to my home in Brooklyn. And at that moment, I'm going to edit it. So I just always just kind of thought of it as just a very unusual type of cognitive experiment into meaning making.
No, that's really interesting. And like you using your sort of, interactions with the ponytail and the props, not knowing what you might want to do with them, but even in that moment, using them as a kind of form of grounding yourself. Because I've always been astounded people that have to travel a lot for work. Because I go somewhere and, you land somewhere 4 hours later and you're like, whoa, like this is, it feels weird,
Yeah.
like cognitively and your body,
Mm-hmm.
like, and so all that movement can really just be really disruptive.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I agree. And if you have any friends that are musicians that have ever talked about going on tour, I think they have a similar kind of internal case study where they talk about how inherently psychologically destabilizing it can be to travel all the time. So, grounding props and activities, I think, become crucial. And, for me, I began to use these different props and gestures and kind of start to weave my own narrative around my day to day. I mean, I guess like many artists, I've always approached art making as a form of agency creation. And so if you're in a system working day to day, it's difficult at all times to have agency, but then art can provide these moments of play, of discovery, of whimsy, where you can just kind of carve out a space for yourself. And yeah, the grounding activities in the hotel rooms with the ponytail really helped me build out this little universe that was all my own. So, kind of regardless of where my agent would send me from week to week, I I could always find a space to belong, as absurd as it might be between the hairs of a ponytail, but
I love that. Well, that does bring me to a question I have been dying to ask you is who is the business witch and how did she come into being? It sounds like maybe this is a little bit how she came into being with your grounding props, but I'd love to hear more.
Right. So I call her Business Witch, but she is me. And Business Witch is the characterization of the way that I really do look and appear in the world as I'm working as a graphic facilitator. Business Witch is an emblem, is an individual who wears all black suit. She has her hair in a ponytail. She's very driven by actions. So she's not necessarily someone who's orating or speaking, but she's always using her hands to problem solve her way through different scenarios. And how the character of Business Witch came to be named was something that actually happened when I was in grad school at Yale getting my MFA in the sculpture program. And it was in a studio visit, I think with Jim Hodges, where he was looking at footage of myself walking around these hotel rooms wearing a black suit and a blonde ponytail. And then he was like, "Who is that?" And I was like, that's Business Witch. And he's like, "Who?" And I'm like, well, that's Business Witch. She's doing magical things and making money.
Yeah, making money is magic. Yeah.
And I have to say at the moment it was just a given for me because that was my normal, and it was interesting to for me as an artist to enter a graduate art program in my late 20s after I'd had many years in my early and mid 20s managing a corporate career, and to have that skill set and then try to weave that live action footage I'd shot of myself into my art studio. And then suddenly it was being analyzed, within a critical dialogue of performative art studies. And so it was trying to, I don't know, I guess find a way of naming the otherness that I had already ascribed to myself. And so Business Witch was born.
Yeah. So it sounds like your professor was, thinking about performance in one way, but performance does seem like a kind of bridge or at least a shared term between the corporate world and, aesthetic practice. And so maybe that wasn't, something intentional at first, but it does seem very much a part of your work now, that sort of connection between the corporate and sort of the aesthetic through performance.
Right. And again, I think part of the connection that I also see between it is that, both activities, whether they be graphic facilitation, working for a corporate client, or being my own visual artist and I'm creating artwork and attuned to my own symbolic system, they both use symbols as methods of communication. And so there is a strange surreal slippage between the two where the same vocabulary of symbols that I might deploy while creating a visual mind map for a corporate client is very similar to the same vocabulary of visual symbols that I might deploy in my own artwork. Just in one instance, it's being used for the very genuine intentionality to create to be very transparent about what the meaning is and what's going on in that scene. And then versus in my own artwork, I really allow those symbols to be as cryptic as they want to be or need to be. I mean, I think it's much more, my artwork is much more of kind of like a space for my own subconscious to kind of run amok.
Yes, it's much more open. You're not looking to foreclose meaning, like in the sense of the graphic facilitation you do in order to capture, what was said. You're more interested in what maybe could be said, if that's one way of
Yes,
putting it.
exactly. And I think to ground it with an example. So, as a graphic facilitator, a prior client of mine has been this nonprofit literacy group named Neuhaus, if I'm saying that right, Neuhaus out of Houston, Texas. And they're very much so interested in trying to create solutions to the massive literacy problem that we have in the United States and actually solve the literacy crisis, which is continuing to exacerbate the fact that I think it's 3 out of 5 adults in US prisons are functionally illiterate.
Mm-hmm.
So getting to work with a wonderful nonprofit like that, hear these types of insights, that type of statistic I just said about illiteracy, in that moment, I'm very responsible in capturing that data point as clearly as possible in an infographic so it makes sense to the audience. Versus in my own art practice, it's much more cryptic. I'm not trying to like lay everything out in an argument that, has a statement with 3 supporting articles. It's much more about embracing the unknown, embracing how symbols can kind of spin around and create their own meanings. I mean, I really like what you said about it just being this open system of interpretation. And I'd also, I guess, then make the argument that I feel like as an artist, I'm always interested in being in dialogue with other feminist surrealist artists that have existed before me. And I think embracing the potential of the subconscious to speak on its own terms and not let symbols be defined is it's just a really exciting domain for me as an artist to participate in. But yeah, it is like the polar opposite of being a graphic facilitator.
Yeah, because you've already said a bit, you're dealing in the subconscious, the surreal, the oniric. I mean, the work itself, the visual mode of your video work is very poetic. Like narratives are very circular.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, it's very beautiful. It's very evocative, and I think you're dealing with some very large concepts. So even though the work is not, in many ways, not like graphic facilitation, I am wondering, like, though, do you use some of that skill set on yourself in the planning of these works? Because you are, in such sort of like cosmically large territory.
Oh, thank you. In a planary sense, I do. I do a lot of visual mind mapping for myself just to find a way of structuring the content that I want to include in a video. Or, for example, as I'm sitting on an airplane traveling to Las Vegas for a hospitality convention, I might think to myself, like, oh, I can't wait to take a photograph of myself, like standing on a bed, holding a ponytail in the air, like it's a divining rod, So I'll kind of sketch out these like very specific gestures that I want to document myself doing in a hotel room. And, in that instance, I do think having a planning mindset can be helpful. I also would say that oftentimes I think my video artwork is perceived as being non-narrative, but in my mind, there really is a causal relationship between an action and an outcome. And, big inspirations to me in video art have always been like Maya Dern, and her artwork might be very dreamlike, but there is kind of an underlining narrative experimental framework that's happening. And I similarly feel like I'm trying to create a surreal experiment, but then also show like a causal effect and the manifestation of my own agency within that process.
Yeah, and I feel like that comes across too in your work. I mean, across even beyond the videos. I mean, you're it's not just a visual experience. It really is like you seem very interested in the multisensorial, and in terms of where you and your agency comes in, that feels particularly potent perhaps in the video format, where sort of like the eye subject eyeball connection of subjectivity is so strong in our culture, that all of your works are like very haptic. Like, I want to touch them all. You're touching things in the videos.
I exactly. I mean, I just love these sensorial processes that allow a body to find grounding. And I guess to bring it back into like a psychoanalytic framework, I guess I'm trying to think back to Freud's writings about art and art production being a form of sublimation. So it's like the mind trying to exercise its conflicting desires, but doing so through a space like art where it can be very open. And then Winnicott, who came about and presented a different proposition to that space where Winnicott was like, well, there's the sublimation that's going on, but it's really important that it's grounded in play because like the intensity of the experience works itself out when there is like a playful exploration that's happening. And I think about that a lot when I'm haptically engaging different materials, especially for video, when I'm pouring honey down a screen and filling it, or running my fingers through strands of hair, or like handling one of my Luna moths that I really like to film in videos. And I'm just always trying to create these spaces of, I don't know, texture and grit. And I think I don't know. I think maybe it's a part of a response to the fact that I think symbols and how they can function, oftentimes they just feel like these flat images. But whenever something starts to feel really viscous, it just triggers that somatic response that inherently feels like it grounds you to a time and a place and a movement. I'm trying to think of another example of I guess, to bring it back to what we were saying earlier about like what are experiments that individuals do, or not experiments, but what are gestures that individuals do to find grounding when they're traveling. I think like somatic physical body ones are some of the best exercises. And so, texture is a way just to, I don't know, stimulate your nervous system. So that way you zap out of a space of like depersonalization, and suddenly you're like, oh, I am present. I'm having an ASMR reaction.
Right. And I mean, and that feels, particularly potent in the sort of corporate world that you move in. I mean, you gave that really, that kind of amazing image that you described earlier of, you going through these huge like conference floors with your long ponytail amid like a sea of just sort of, like, it feels very much a way of you also trying to like break out, or at least find your place, like a place in that world that is yours, that maybe isn't following the logics of that place.
Yes. And I just thought of an example to share with you that does relate back to that question that you mentioned earlier about sight and being seen and the gaze. So I have an experience that happened back in 2014 when I was scribing at South by Southwest Interactive for Neil Young. So Neil Young, the famous musician, also in 2014 was pitching a type of software, hardware, Pono media player. And I was standing adjacent to a stage that Neil Young was presenting upon. And behind me was an audience of 5,000 individuals, which is a lot of people. And I remember having this moment of like slowly turning around to look at everyone, because you have to remember kind of the choreographic setup of my scribing environment is I'm facing the whiteboard. So I don't face the crowd like Neil Young. I face the whiteboard, even though I'm like 15 feet away from Neil Young. And so I turned around and I saw like 10,000 eyeballs, and I had a totally strange, surreal moment of like, this is so many eyes. I can't take it. I don't want to absorb the gaze of 10,000 eyes, but you know what? my ponytail can absorb the gaze of 10,000 eyes. So I turn around and face the board, and then the spectators watch the ponytail that's attached to me move about in front of the board. So I felt like sharing that particular image, one, just to say the viewership dynamics of these high intensity, somewhat theatrical corporate environments are very strange viewership dynamics, but also that this ponytail character that I have really is something that exists outside of me in a really weird documented way, because at all these corporate events, there are always photographers that are floating around capturing every second of the moment. Later those images might appear on Getty. And so if you search through a lot of the Getty images, you will see like a woman wearing all black with a blonde ponytail in front of a whiteboard at all these different North American conferences. And it's just,
Whoa.
It's just a really strange viewership dynamic. Yeah. And then I think about how all those different images are then circulating as just like raw data out there. And then here I am like intentionally inserting my own narrative of the ponytail's movements via my own like humble Google SEO website markings. And it's like the degrees of performativity in that moment become really meta, but it also just, again, makes me feel like there's agency to be found in these situations, which just seems so strange and outside oneself.
Yes. No, totally. Have you ever thought about trying to use any of those images in your own work?
That's a great idea. I haven't at this moment. I feel like I'd need to spend some time with some Sherry Levine texts on appropriation, but
Yeah.
I'm not opposed to it, and I kind of like knowing that it's out there. I guess to bring it back to like the ponytail and the hotel room footage, I've definitely tapped into some of that footage in my own video artwork, but I also just want to hint at the fact that I have a huge archive of footage of the ponytail in the hotel room that I'm hoping to deploy like after 20 years.
Oh,
so that way I can actually show. Yeah, I'm really excited about being able to show the material, like showing material temporality through the shifting landscape of interior hotel design aesthetics. And then the ponytail not only serves as like the material, but the proverbial thread line throughout the entire clip series. Anyway, but this is a project that, I need another 10 years to make. But yeah, so I'm just always really excited about thinking about how I can, I don't know, play these different instances out. I don't know. I feel like making video art is like playing 4-dimensional chess with yourself,
Yeah, that is a good way to put it. That is a good way to put it. It hurts my head a little bit, but that makes sense. A lot of video art hurts my head too.
I mean, it makes sense to me. I mean, that's why I only create like 2 or 3 works a year, because I feel like there's a lot of intentionality that goes into not only the sequencing of frames, but then also the syncing up of different Foley sounds that I record. I might be recording like the funky hum of a specific air conditioning system in a trade show floor, and then like weaving that sound effect back in. And, a viewer may not be able to specifically identify it, but I think it helps build out the kind of sensorial environment. I mean, I also like the idea of trying to create an artwork that is a type of field recording of a moment, although it might be one that's like highly banal, but there's like a magical mundane thing going on.
Right. I was going to say, I mean, by you drawing attention to it becomes a way of, sort of finding that that spark, in what sort of like a white noise, like an AC unit literally might not even register for most people, walking through a room. I do have a question that's sort of, it's sort of related to the ponytail. I mean, there in your example, you're talking about kind of the way the ponytail other people sort of transform it. Like you end up using it as a sort of, protection and then like reclaiming it for yourself. Along
Mhm.
those lines, I I really want to ask you about your square French tip manicure that is
Oh
featured in all
yeah.
of your videos. Because it strikes me along these same sort of lines, where it feels very performative in terms of a professional femme
Mhm.
character. Um, for those of you listening at home, in Virginia's videos, she often her hands will reach into the screen disembodied, and they're always perfectly manicured, but it's always a square filed French tip manicure.
Yes, yes. So I I started wearing the manicure in my early 20s when I was working in New York City as a graphic facilitator because clients were constantly photographing my hands and then mentioning my hands, and I just became very aware that my hands were symbols and also really became symbols of my graphic facilitation process. And how that bled into my video art practice is I gave a lot of deep thinking into the world of the French manicure, and in my opinion, why it's absolutely strange because it reaches this like realm of the simulacra where if you actually aesthetically analyze what a French manicure is, there's a fleshy part of it that's supposed to emulate the actual flesh color of your nail bed, but it's not exactly that. It's like maybe like slightly a shade too pink and idealized. And then the top of the French manicure also relates to, that I don't know what the technical term of it is, but when the keratin at the top of your nail bed begins to kind of change colors and bleach out a little bit. And then that's exemplified with like a dab of white paint at the top. So the actual French manicure itself is in reference to kind of the biological pigmentation state of the keratin nail bed, but it's just amped up. And, I think about that functioning as a symbol and how kind of absurd it is to be an artist who makes everything with my hands, and yet I have this manicure that I'm constantly having to retouch all the time. And I will say, if you run into me, on the street, my manicure is not going to look as stunning as it does in videos because I definitely touch it up before film. But I'm really interested in that symbolic space, and yeah, I like the fact that it does become like an icon for hyper femme performativity, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. If anything, I'm glad that it makes people suddenly think about labor and how gender is perceived through the application of pigment and resin on fingers. It's such an absurd thing to think about.
No, I know, but it's this level of detail. I mean, detail is an important. I mean, your video work arguably is all detail, but it's like your attention to that level of detail is what really makes the work so rich. Because yeah, I mean, it's your hands. Like we work with our
Mm-hmm.
hands.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's very smart. It's a very smart visual sort of encapsulation of a lot of what your work in day jobs, especially too in Pony Cocoon, we get to see the fingernail.
Yes, yeah. There's a lot of the fingernail comes through. I should also say that part of the reason my own hands appear in all my video artwork is that I want people to always know that I am a kind of a one woman working machine, and I've made all of this work myself. Here are my own hands. And part of the gesture in doing that came from a moment of inspiration I had when I was reading an interview by Bjork. And Bjork was talking about how, over the course of her career, even though she's always been involved in the sound production and the audio sequencing of her own work, many interviewers always just want to think of her as this charismatic performer that's a singer, but she's like really someone that's involved sitting at a computer, moving around bits of data in order to get her beats and her rhythms. And so now, if she has the ability to kind of direct what an interview looks like, she wants to be photographed like at her computer with her sound software as a way of being like, no, I made this. And so when I put my hands in my video, I want people to know, like, not only are these the hands that are performing the gesture in the video, but these are the same hands that are going to be sitting in Final Cut Pro for the next like 200 hours. Because it's again, it's all about agency. You know, I'm trying to like break down that depersonalization and be like, no, this is how things get done.
Yeah, it might look, easy in the video, things are elided, but all of that work that goes in between the cuts, it's not small.
Thanks. But there's a lot of intentional choice in how much screen time I give my own body and context to the other objects or props or non-human collaborators that appear on the screen. But I feel like I'm most comfortable just being a hand.
I don't blame you. Hand acting is its own very weird and cool thing. You can kind of feel like yourself, but not yourself at the same time. It seems,
Yes.
it seems powerful. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I do have one last question. I'm wondering how you first got involved with your little Lepidopteran friends.
Oh,
is that like a long-standing interest of yours, or?
yes. So I love your use of the technical term for moths and butterflies. I love that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. No, I love it. I've had a deep love and admiration for moths and butterflies my entire life. And I think there's something so incredibly fantastic and otherworldly about insects. And I think that comes from the fact that I've just been doing a lot of research over the years about, to bring it back to symbols and symbolism, like what is the definition of a symbol? It's I don't know, it's a word, a sound, a gesture, an idea that communicates or conveys an idea. And moths and butterflies are fantastic living embodiments of how symbols can be communicated or stay stagnant over thousands of years. And what I'm speaking to specifically is the use of eye spots on butterfly wings. And so I'm trying to think about, so insects are much, much older than us as hominoids. And right now I'm thinking back in my mind, I'm trying to visualize like a working timeline of creatures on this planet. And I feel like the late Cretaceous was 65 million years ago. And that was like the end of the last era of dinosaurs, what you will. But from the fossil record, we know that moths and butterflies were flittering around with eye spots on their wings, like up to 10 million years ago, which is pretty wild to think about. That icon of an eye spot on the wing of a moth or a butterfly has stayed consistent as a mechanism for that organism to like signal I'm a predator or I'm an attractive member of my species to procreate with. I don't know. I'm really interested in that symbol of the sphere of the eye has stayed so consistent. Moths and butterflies are living biological evidence of that. And so over the years of being a graphic facilitator, I'm always really interested in like what symbols hold resonance. And so looking at the work of Jung is like a really wonderful example of what symbols seem to hold resonance, and then also looking in biology, like at moths and butterflies. That's another space. And then being my own artist, I feel like in the last 2 years, I've slowly been revealing how much of a real nerd I am about biology and just starting to unabashedly raise moths and butterflies in the name of video art and just incorporate those life processes into my video art. And I have to say, it's definitely complicating the system more and more, but I'm okay with that. And throughout the pandemic, I've really just been working from home and raising even more moths and butterflies. And that brings me to the current place of the work that I'm making right now in video, which is even more macro footage, analyzing the surreal traverse of the Luna moth from kind of ovoidal state to ovoidal state. So it goes from cocoon to, it goes from egg to cocoon to then emerging from the cocoon and having these eye spots that it's just totally symbolically strange, and then also really beautiful and visceral. And so moths and butterflies they're just infinitely inspiring. And I guess maybe in a way, every time I enter my own hotel room working as a graphic facilitator, I feel like I'm inside some type of cocoon space, and I'm always just really excited to think like what idea I'll burst out of there with.
Well, I can't think of a better way to conclude our conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you
that
so
was
much.
Beautiful. I just want to say thank you for letting us into your world. I wish we could spend all day there with you and your moths.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak about my work and share my passions, and also reveal a little bit about the niche world of graphic facilitation, and likewise my extreme love for video art, moths, performance, all those fantastic things. So thank you.